Honduras is returning to democracy with the upcoming inauguration, which is set for January. I heard from Grahame Russell. He is the Director of Rights Action, a North American-based solidarity organization, about what the Canadian government and multinationals here have to do with the last 12 years of dictatorship, which we saw in Honduras.
Canada followed the U.S. line 100% in June 28, 2009, and supported and legitimized the coup. And this was led by the United States, but Canada took a front row seat. And there were stolen elections in 2017, but there was fraudulent, violent elections in 2009, 2013, and 2017, and they were all accepted as legitimate democratic processes by Canada and the US, and they were all fraudulent and they were all violent. So the 2017 elections were just the worst of the three sets of stolen, fraudulent elections. This Libre party should have won all three of the elections. Finally, they won because of the weight of the support of the Honduran people, despite fraud, despite violence, and despite the support of the Canadian and US governments for what can only be called a narco-trafficking, military-backed regime. And Canada did so following the line of the United States for these 12 years and 5 months for political reasons and to favor global corporations and global investors. We just co-edited a book called Testimonio, which is with my co-author and editor Catherine Nolan and I, and it's about Canadian mining companies in Guatemala. Rights Action's been supporting these community defense struggles, human rights, land, and environmental defense struggles for 17 years, suffering harms and violence committed by mainly Canadian companies, also American companies and Swiss companies. The Canadian government is fully supporting the expansion of Canadian mining interests, just in Guatemala, for example. We also work in Honduras. For years leading up to the coup and after the coup, the Canadian government was openly supporting the expansion of Canadian mining interests in Honduras. How do they do this? They do this through global affairs by using diplomatic power, diplomatic weight, and through the embassies to encourage governments to reform their laws, change their laws. We have CETA grants or Canadian aid grants that sometimes pay for people to reform laws in other countries to favor access by foreign companies and foreign investors like Canadian mining companies. This happened in the case of Honduras right after the coup. Canada aggressively went in soon after the coup to push for the signing of a free trade agreement, a bilateral free trade agreement between Canada and the coup regime in Honduras that had just carried out a military coup. And then we had funding to reform their mining law, and all of this favors Canadian mining company interests. So the Canadian government is fully involved in spreading the expansion of Canadian economic interests around the world, and then it caps it all off by turning a blind eye to, or sometimes outright lying about if and when the harms and violations occur, which is also the case that we've dealt with in Guatemala and in Honduras, and a lot of these stories are set out in a book like Testimonio. And there's been no accountability whatsoever in Canada. Where does it go from here? Will Canada start to change its policies towards countries around the world, particularly in the global south? I don't think so. Like, they'll say all the right things, but I don't think Canada has any sort of political will in the near future to change their policies whatsoever. They have to live with the new government of President Xiomara Castro, but they will follow the lead of the United States and probably try and find ways to pressure her government to keep favoring the interests of global corporations and global investors, hiding behind sort of speeches about the respect for democracy, rule of law, and sovereignty and all that.
What are some of those experiences that you've heard on what the toll has been on these different sectors who have decided to leave the country?
The people who were able to leave Honduras as political refugees and get accepted with formal refugee status in other countries, some in Canada, some of them lived in my home, many in the United States, of course, and off to Europe, they would number in the hundreds, if not thousands. The people that were forced to flee the country as forced migrants because of the oppression, violence, corruption, and impunity of that government numbers in the hundreds of thousands. they're forced to flee just as much as a political refugee who wins their case before a refugee board. And that's the real sign of the devastation, is the hundreds of thousands of Hondurans who were forced to flee individually as forced migrants or in forced migrant caravans or whatever you want to call them. That's one of the truths about what this coup regime was about. And this is the type of government that the Canadian and U.S. governments were supporting. Then you get into the whole hollowing out or corruption of government institutions. That will take a long time to start to recover. There's a lot of capacity in Honduras. There's a lot of capacity in the judiciary, in the legislative branch, the executive branch. But how long will it take to weed out the corruption and the indicators of impunity that have now so characterized all the institutions of the government and state? That is a huge challenge. And that's on their plate now, and they'll get no support to do that from outside the country. I see no gap whatsoever between the policies of conservative and liberal governments towards Latin America in general, without getting into Africa or other parts of the world. Canada is a rich, powerful country, allied with the richest, most powerful country on the planet, the United States, long allied with the former imperialist and colonial powers, Britain and France. That is who we are. That is our circle of friends. We are in that group of the G7. We take pride being in the G7. It should be an embarrassment to anyone who cares about democracy or equality to be a member of the G7. It's like an old private white men's club in downtown Toronto somewhere. But that's the club we're in. Those are our allies on anything related to so-called foreign policy issues, economics, politics, militarism, invasions. Liberal and conservative parties alike will support them, and whatever our allies are doing, our so-called allies, United States, France, and Britain, we'll just do it. And the media will more or less agree to it and not look critically at it. There would be a lot of differences between liberals and conservatives on domestic policies or certain areas of domestic policies, but on foreign policy, there's no gap whatsoever. On domestic issues, our media, there'll be much more of a diversity of opinion, delving into local municipal issues, provincial issues, federal issues. And even then, I would say there's some serious gaps. But anything to do with foreign policy issues, it's almost towing one simple line. Whatever the foreign policy is of the government of the day, which is usually conservative or liberal, that is what the media will more or less represent, justify, or at best they'll just ignore it or give it a pass. And that's where most Canadians get their information, is from a smallish number of media outlets, whether it's radio, written, television, etc. And it becomes part of the problems that we're trying to address and deal with.
What do you think the role is of average Canadian citizens? And I mean, why did you even, start Rights Action and all this solidarity work?
It is our role. We need to hold ourselves responsible for the policies and actions of our own governments and companies and investors, whether it's inside our borders or around the world. It's sort of a fundamental principle of democracy, good governance, transparency, rule of law, human rights. Like, you're responsible for yourself. And so if Canadians are voting for governments that have these policies, we should be held responsible. If we're paying our taxes to a government that's funding these types of policies, we should be held responsible. If our government's overtly supporting corrupt, anti-democratic regimes, that's our corruption. That is our violence. That is our impunity. We should be holding ourselves responsible. The challenge is how to get the message, this information out in a fair and balanced way. And thus we come back to the role of media, etc.